Okay, welcome to the third recap lesson for the USA Civil Rights Movement, and today we're going to be focusing on the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which is probably one of the most important events in the Civil Rights Movement and definitely the most significant event in the 1950s. So if we just have a look at what we have achieved, we've achieved so much so far. So we've looked at Black Americans in the 1950s, so the context, the background to the Civil Rights Movement and the early Civil Rights Movement. We've looked at opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at progress in education, so that involves Brown versus Topeka and Little Rock High School. And we are currently looking at the Montgomery Bus Boycott, so the causes and events, the success of the Montgomery Bus Boycott and why it was successful, and then also the consequences of the boycott. Okay, so we shall begin with the causes of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So the first cause is the arrest of Rosa Parks. This is the real trigger event that kickstarts the boycott. Okay, so a very famous story. On the 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. So, as you know, transport was segregated, so there was a certain section of the bus for white people, a certain section called the coloured section for black people. If the white section was full, then a black person would be required to give up their seat for a white person and just stand up on the bus. But Rosa Parks refused to do this. And as a reaction to this, the bus driver called the police and Parks was arrested for this crime. So the Women's Political Council, which was a civil rights group in Montgomery, as a form of protest to Parks's arrest, called for a one-day boycott of buses in Montgomery. So this meant that a boycott means avoiding using the buses and to show that you are opposed to their treatment of black people. So the next day, 90% of black people who usually took the bus in Montgomery boycotted them. This was a resounding success for the Women's Political Council. So we need to think, why Rosa Parks? She wasn't the first black person in Montgomery to be arrested for refusing to give up her seat. So why did the arrest of Parks lead to such a significant event? Well, firstly, there was already a feeling of or a movement against segregated transport in Montgomery. So the WPC had already been active in trying to encourage bus reform and the desegregation of transport. They had already warned the mayor of Montgomery that they would boycott the buses. So there was already this feeling in place by the WPC, and Parks served as a figurehead, as a kind of trigger for them to call the boycott. Why Rosa Parks specifically? Well, she was a respectable and well-regarded member of the community. She was middle class. She was a good Christian. So this, if she was to gain a lot of media attention, there would be nothing shady about her past to try and stop the movement and criticise the movement. She was also involved in the civil rights movement herself. So she was a member of the NAACP and she had been trained in non-violent protest. This meant she would have looked good and known how to behave during a boycott because she had already been briefed in the principles of the civil rights movement at the time. Another key cause of the boycott is the Montgomery Improvement Association. This is set up on the 5th of December 1955, so 4 days after Parks's arrest, and its aims were to improve the lives of black people in Montgomery. So it supported the boycott and called for it to be extended until there was desegregation. So remember, firstly, the boycott was only meant to last 1 day. The Montgomery Improvement Association took the boycott on and extended it until they saw improvements to the lives of black people in Montgomery. And Martin Luther King was elected as the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association in December 1955. Why Martin Luther King? He was new in Montgomery, he just moved there, so he had no enemies among the white officials, which meant that hopefully he could try and negotiate with them. He was a clergyman, so he was a priest, he worked for the church, so although he was new, he was very well respected by the black community. He was very well educated, as he was a Dr. Martin Luther King. He had many years of university education, and also he agreed with the values of the civil rights movement, which was non-violent direct action as a way to achieve desegregation, equality, and civil rights. So he really he adopted that message and really believed in it. So those are the causes. Let's move on to the events. So we start off on the 5th of December 1955. Sorry, it's a bit blocked out there by the camera. This is when the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, met the bus company, who refused to consider any changes. So they met together to negotiate, and the bus company said no. So the MIA reacted by deciding to continue the boycott for as long as necessary. Okay, this boycott ends up lasting 381 days, which is more than a year, just over a year. So the MIA were determined to achieve desegregation, and until that happened, they were prepared to boycott. A few days later, on the 12th of December, the MIA sets up a carpool system. And this is the idea of sharing cars, people sharing lifts, so they can still get to work whilst avoiding public transport. So that means that people who want to take part in the boycott can avoid the buses, but they can still get to work by sharing cars. Just to remember, not everyone has a car. They do rely on public transport, so the carpool system allows them to still get to work. Going into 1956, 30th of January, Martin Luther King's home is bombed. He is unhurt, and harassment of the boycotters increases. So white reaction, white violence towards the boycotters increases from January 1956. On the 1st of February 1956, the NAACP take Montgomery to court. So they filed the case called Browder versus Gale, which occurs in the Supreme Court, which calls for an end to segregation on transport. So just like Brown versus Topeka called for an end to segregation in schools, Browder versus Gale is the same, but for transport. Later that month, on the 22nd of February, 89 MIA members, including Martin Luther King himself, are arrested. Now, this arrest and their trial really increases publicity for the boycott, because the MIA prided themselves on being non-violent, and they made their case in court that they were non-violent and it was the white officials who were in the wrong. A couple of months later, on the 11th of May, Browder versus Gale goes to trial in the Supreme Court. Less than a month later, Browder versus Gale is successful. The NAACP win their case, and the Supreme Court orders desegregation to take place on public transport. This takes a few months to be put into place, and the boycott continues during this until the 20th of December 1956, when the boycott ends. It lasted 381 days. We started off with segregated transport in Montgomery, and by the 20th of December 1956, we have desegregated transport in Montgomery. So it's a huge success for the civil rights movement. Our question now is, why was the boycott such a success? Our first reason is commitment. So the boycotters persisted despite threats, loss of their jobs, going to jail, bombings, even the loss of their lives. So we've seen examples of this during when we looked at the timeline, but we really can see that the boycotters, the members of the civil rights movement in Montgomery, were determined to achieve their goal, and commitment and their dedication for the whole year of the boycott really made it a success. Is organisation. So there was already a strong civil rights movement in Montgomery. Groups such as the NAACP and WPC already had good contacts, huge numbers of members and supporters in Montgomery, so there was the infrastructure in place to organise a boycott. And also the MIA played a really significant role in coordinating the boycott. Most notably, they set up the carpool system, which allowed people to get to work but still take part in the boycott, meaning that the boycott could last for as long as it did, 381 days, because it reduced the conflict between being part of the protest and being able to go to work. And the final reason is publicity, and this is something we're going to see coming up a lot more as we look at the civil rights movement going into the 1960s. People were well informed about the boycott, so there were many leaflets produced, church services given, and the civil rights movement really used the local press to spread awareness and get people involved in the boycott. The MIA had many public meetings as well that kept people informed of progress and decision making. And also the publicity from events such as the bombing of Martin Luther King's home or the arrest of the 89 MIA members made the civil rights movement look really good in the face of white violence. So it showed that the civil rights movement was using non-violence whilst the white opposition was reacting with violence. So it made the civil rights movement look really good. And our final reason is leadership. Okay, so Martin Luther King, MLK, he was a very inspiring speaker, or a really nice word we might use there is orator, and he gave many speeches which made him incredibly popular and a real figurehead of the boycott. But there were also some other important leaders who were less well known as Martin Luther King. Joanne Robinson was the head of the WPC. She is the person who called for the initial one-day boycott when Parks was arrested. E.D. Nixon, he was involved in the NAACP and the Browder versus Gale case. Ralph Abernathy, who was a clergyman and an NAACP member. So three very significant people there. So thinking about the consequences of the boycott, it's an incredibly successful event for the civil rights movement. It showed that black people could organise mass resistance if they were well organised and they got good publicity. It showed that MLK was a very significant figure and would prove to be a very significant figure in the civil rights movement. And it showed that non-violent direct action, even in the face of violence, did work and could be successful. A key consequence of the Montgomery bus boycott is the passing of the 1957 Civil Rights Act by President Eisenhower, pictured there signing it. So this Civil Rights Act allowed courts to prosecute any kind of violation of voting rights. So think back to the first lesson when we learned about how Black Americans were prevented from voting. Now we've got a law in place that should any of these kind of dodgy dealings, these preventions take place, black people can take that to court and prosecute anybody who has prevented them from voting. Why this is significant is because it shows it's the first example where the US government is supporting civil rights. So it's a good example of publicity for the civil rights movement. However, it didn't really work because juries, so the people who decided guilty or not guilty in the court, juries were still all whites only. So if a black person did take a case to court, it was extremely likely that these violations would not be dealt with and they'd just be ignored. So also at the same time, the Act showed the power of white Southern opposition to civil rights. It showed that white people weren't going to accept it in the South. Our last consequence of the Montgomery bus boycott is the setting up of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the SCLC. This is set up in 1957, led by Martin Luther King, and it aims to coordinate church-based protest across the South. So it's not just looking at a single state, it's now looking at mass resistance through different states. And its main aim is to end segregation through non-violent direct action. Okay, so having a look at what we've covered so far. So we've looked at these three. in previous videos. Now we can tick off the Montgomery Bus Boycott. We've revised it and you're going to do some revision tasks on it now. Thank you very much for listening to my video. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Please let me know if there's anything you still don't understand and I can look at making another video on that topic. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye bye.